In this video, I'm going to briefly discuss some of the evidence there is for evolution. One big piece of evidence is fossil evidence, of course, looking at organisms that have lived in the past. Fossils show what organisms looked like in the past, and of course, how the past organism has changed or evolved since that time. And so, while the fossil record is incomplete, meaning we don't have the fossil of every organism that ever lived, we do have pieces of that fossil record, and we can piece together the order in which things happened and the changes that occurred. For example, here is a modern day horse, and we're looking back in time at its teeth as well as at its forelimbs and the bone structure. You can see that the height has changed, and the shape and size of different parts of their bodies has changed over time. We can also look at currently living organisms, and this is called comparative anatomy, comparing the anatomy of different organisms. Comparative anatomy studies the similarities and differences in structures of different species. One sort of part of comparative anatomy are these things called homologous structures, that homo prefix meaning the same. Homologous structures are similar structures in species, and they are similar because these structures were inherited from a common ancestor that also had these structures. And so descendants, so currently living organisms, may or may not use the structures the same way as the ancestor did, but they still have these structures in some fashion. This is a big example. If you Google image comparative anatomy or homologous structures, you will see this image comparing the arm structure, bone structure of different organisms. All of these are mammals. But with very different lives. We have humans, cats, whales, and bats. But you can see they all have the same types of bones that serve relatively the same purpose, the same number of those different types, and the same order that they exist in, which leads us to believe that some ancestor had all of this bone structure as well. Analogous structures, this analogous is going to mean different or divergent. Analogous structures are similar structures used for similar functions, but in unrelated organisms, which is where that analogous comes in. So they're the same structures, but they didn't come from a common ancestor. And so this is a big thing because these structures evolved separately to do the exact same job, meaning that that function and that structure happens to be possibly one of the best structures for that particular environment or for that particular purpose. So it evolved multiple times. These are, an example of this is wings. We have bat wings, bird wings, insect wings, okay? Evolved sort of separately. You can see that bats and birds have similar bone structure, but not the same in terms of their wing structure. And then, of course, the insect wings still have those same supports built in for their wings, but these are not homologous with the bones of bat wings and bird wings. So that's comparative anatomy. Sort of an offshoot of that is comparative embryology. So we're comparing embryos of different species. Comparative embryology is the study of similarities and differences between embryos of different species. And these similarities in embryos are, again, evidence of common ancestry, things developing from a common ancestor. One big sort of example of comparative embryology and our study of it is that all vertebrate embryos have gill slits and tails at some point. So vertebrates are anything with a vertebra. So fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, all of those are vertebrates. Here we're comparing a lizard. I don't know if you can see the text there. Lizard, tortoise, pig, and human. And you can find a lot more of these if you Google image comparative embryology. But at some point they all have gill slits and they all have a tail. And some of these organisms lose one or both of those in adulthood because the adults no longer use them, but This leads us to believe that there was a common ancestor whose embryos developed in this same way. Again, comparing anatomy, we have vestigial structures. These are going to be structures that have over time reduced in size and are no longer used in the modern organisms the same way they were used in the ancestral organism. A couple of human examples, our tailbone and our appendix. We don't use them the same as our ancestors did. Whale hip bones. Whales have hip bones and yet they have no hips. So that's a vestigial structure. It's highly reduced. And another one is this cave-dwelling fish that is blind. And yet it still has eyes. It doesn't use them. None of the fish can see, and yet it still has eyes. Why would it have those eyes if it doesn't see at all and none of the current organisms do? It's because they evolved from a common ancestor which did have eyes. And so again, vestigial structures suggest that some sort of ancestor used these organs. And currently, we can also compare DNA sequence. This is something that Darwin could not do, of course. He didn't have the technology to compare DNA sequences. Today, we can compare DNA sequences to tell how closely organisms are related. And frequently, we will look at specific genes and how close that specific gene is among different organisms. This chart is showing the number of amino acids that differ from a human hemoglobin protein, and hemoglobin is used in blood. And so 0, of course, differences in humans because it is a human hemoglobin. Not that many differences in monkeys, more and more. And yet still, there's still a large amount of similarities. I mean, look at chickens. Over 50% of the protein is the same among us. So it is providing very strong evidence for common ancestry. The last piece that we're going to talk about is biogeography. It's going to be the study of how and why plants and animals live where they do, and also how they have adapted to have certain traits that are going to suit the particular environment in which they live. So here, this shows that camels originally, the ancestors of camels came from North America, and yet currently they only live in Asia, Africa, this sort of area, as well as in South America. So they're all members of the camel family, and yet they have each evolved separate adaptations to suit where they live. This was a big thing that Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands, and we consider these to be Darwin's finches. The Galapagos Islands are believed to, all the finches are believed to have descended from an original group of finches that came across from South America. And since then, all of the different finches have evolved, especially different beak structures based on the plants that exist on the various islands and what they eat. So you can see here all of the different beaks. You can see what they eat. So this organism is the only fruit eater. Then there's insect eaters, cactus eaters, and seed eaters. And lots of different sizes for what their bills are used for. Crushing bills, probing, grasping, and then sort of parrot-like. And also where they live, whether they live in the tree or if they're ground finches. So that is the study of biogeography, and these are sort of a brief introduction to some of the evidence pieces that we have for evolution.